All right. Hi, everyone. Like Quentin said, my name is Seth. I'm a junior information systems major, but more importantly, I work with JavaScript pretty much every day. I'm both considered a front-end developer and a back-end developer. So I'm primarily a Ruby developer, but almost all my front-end work, I use JavaScript or jQuery or some other framework. But basically, as with any amazing talk, we have to start out with a definition. So this is kind of my definition of JavaScript that would have been valid about a year ago, which is a programming language that web browsers understand. So it's a language that allows us to add interactions, designs, fade in, fade out, move objects that we can't do with just HTML and CSS. However, about a year ago, we had Node.js come out, and now JavaScript has actually evolved into a server-side language, which is beyond the scope of this talk, but the things that we talk about today also apply in creating server-side logic, just like you would with PHP or Ruby or any other programming language. You can now write WebSockets and servers using JavaScript. So I've reworked this definition, which is a development tool that computers and servers understand, which is really just the definition of any programming language, because that's what JavaScript has become. It's evolved significantly over the past few years, and it's really cool. So this is cooler. This is JS Fiddle. It's not something I'm going to use today because of time constraints, but it's a really great tool for CSS and JavaScript and just interactions, in addition to the Webkit inspector, which I'll show later. But basically, you type in your HTML code or a snippet. It doesn't even have to be valid HTML. You give it some CSS, and you give it some JavaScript. And in the lower left-hand pane there, it'll actually render the result for you. And this is great if you're working on a forum where you're communicating with other people and you want to see how this looks in different browsers. And you see on the left, you can check different boxes, check different frameworks. One of the frameworks over there is jQuery, which we'll talk about later. You can change your handlers, change everything. So it's really great when you're collaborating with people and you want to say, here's this little snippet of code I wrote. Instead of shooting it over email or putting it in a text file and moving it over Git, you can actually just send them a link to a fiddle or a JS fiddle, and they can very easily edit it, play with it, see what it looks like in their browser, and send you back some changes. I'm going to pick on SquirrelMail a lot. This is not. There's no JavaScript in SquirrelMail. And yes, CMU redid the interface, but it still sucks. There's no nice way to put it. How many people use SquirrelMail? OK, how many people don't use SquirrelMail? How many people use a desktop client instead of SquirrelMail? Yeah. So especially when things like email applications or anytime we want interaction where keyboard shortcuts or the ability to move things with our keyboard without taking our hands onto the mouse, that's all done with JavaScript in a web page. It's a little bit different for console-based applications, but anytime we want some kind of significant interaction beyond a hover state, we have to use JavaScript. SquirrelMail doesn't. So essentially, JavaScript it's a useful tool. It's designed for interaction, but it's just generally awesome. Back in the days of the JavaScript wars, back whenever not every browser had the same way for interpreting JavaScript, which is still kind of the case, but it's becoming a lot better, browsers would compete to see who could compute JavaScript the fastest. And now Google has won with their V8 engine, which is actually what Node is built on. They compute JavaScript faster than any other browser, and they use some really cool things to do that. Google's V8 engine is actually open source. You can use it to make your computer process JavaScript for you if you don't want to have the browser do it. But it's just a lot easier to have Chrome or Firefox or Safari do it for you. So along came HTML5, and now JavaScript became a necessity. It's everywhere. JavaScript is Facebook, it's Google, it's Twitter, it's everywhere. Every single one of these sites use JavaScript. And now, in Twitter's case, they built their own JavaScript framework that they use. It eventually boils down to JavaScript, but it makes their lives easier. Just like jQuery, which we'll talk about later, is a framework that's open source that a lot of developers use to make selecting tags and performing animations a lot easier. But a lot of the things you see on Facebook and Twitter, when you hover over a post and the little X shows up, then you can delete the post. And when you click the X, you have the little drop-down box that shows up. That's all done with JavaScript. And without JavaScript, we would have a hell of a time trying to do that, because CSS is very static. You really only have hover states. Even with CSS3 and some of the pseudo classes, you don't really have the capability to do a lot of these cool drop-down menus, animations, those kind of things. So now we can talk a little bit about the core of JavaScript, so kind of what is it? How many people have taken like functional programming with SML? Cool. So JavaScript is a functional language. For those of you that don't know what that is, like the really simple definition is like, okay, what do we consider a function? So a function is like a method, it's a value. In Ruby, it's like a definition. In PHP, it's a function. The general idea and the way JavaScript is really cool is that you can pass functions as values. So this is a function, right? It has a declaration, it has a name, it has a parameter. And in other in other regular languages, for example, like Java, x could be like an integer. We would have to declare its type. It could be like a Boolean. It could be an object. It could be some parameterized type. But it couldn't be a function until Java 9 comes out. It won't be a function. But in JavaScript, x can be a string. It can be an integer. It can be an object. It can be null. But most importantly, that x can be a function. And we can pass functions back and forth to other functions. So this is where recursion gets a little bit confusing, and life can be confusing, especially when you're dealing with loops and recursive calls. And it's quite a headache, but this is actually what makes JavaScript really, really cool. Because I can pass as a parameter another function and yield it or call it within that parent function. And I can even make changes to it within the parent function. So that's the primary difference between programming languages that you haven't worked with that are functional and programming languages like JavaScript. And we'll see some examples later when we start to code about how functional languages can really get you in a headache, but they're also really cool for certain things. So what does this mean? This means that in JavaScript, functions are first-class objects. You can create them on the fly. You can pass them around as objects. You can edit them on the fly. And that's really cool. This still isn't. So that was like the boring history part. Kind of like, are there any JavaScript questions? And then I'm just going to move into coding with you guys because I'm a firm believer that the only way you actually learn something is by doing it yourself. So do you guys have any questions about like the history of JavaScript or kind of how it works before we move into like hardcore coding? It's not really hardcore. I lied. It's pretty basic stuff. Cool. All right. So yeah, okay, let's code. So if you open up a text editor, I just use TextMate because it's my favorite, but you guys can use whatever as long as you're using plain text editor. Don't use like TextMate for Mac or TextEdit for Mac unless you make it plain text first. Sublime Text 2 is good. So if we just make a new kind of HTML file here, for those of you that went to Ryan's talk, we're just going to like scaffold a really basic HTML page. So we'll say HTML, we'll give it a head tag with a title. We're going to make an application called To-Dos. You can title it whatever you want. For right now, we're just going to give it a body, and that's it. And we'll just save this. This is like very basic HTML page. Everyone can see that okay, right? And we're not doing any kind of JavaScript. So if we take this HTML page and we open it up in our browser, we're going to see a wonderful plain white page. But before we actually write any JavaScript, let's actually play around in what's called the WebKit inspector and the interactive JavaScript console. So if you're using Chrome, you can hit Command-Alt-I, or you can go up to the window and go View, Developer, Developer Tools. And this will bring up this nice little console here, which is kind of hard to see on the small screen. But if you click the console tab, you can see like we can type stuff in here. And kind of like the debugging statement in JavaScript, the debugging statement in Java is like system.out.println. It's really long and everyone hates typing it. The one for JavaScript is console.log. So I can say like console.log, hello world, and this is fun and exciting, and it says hello world. It returns the result. And one of the things to note about JavaScript is that it returned a result here of undefined because the console.log function doesn't actually return anything. So in addition to performing things, every function will return something. If you don't implicitly return a value, JavaScript will return undefined, which is JavaScript's version of a mesh between like null and nothingness, which is something that's really confusing about JavaScript, which we'll talk about later, is that it has undefined and null, and there's subtle differences between the two. but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what's interesting is that unlike other languages, you don't have to use double quotes. So Java, you have to use double quotes if you want more than a character. In JavaScript, we can just use single quotes. It doesn't really care. Also, string concatenation and addition are overloaded in JavaScript. So we use the plus sign for addition, but we also use the plus sign for string concatenation. So in this case, I have the string hello and the string space world with an exclamation point, and we're going to get, again, the same result. JavaScript does some auto type promotion too. So if I were to do this, I'm actually going to get hello world with the string 1, because Java will promote JavaScript. I keep saying Java, sorry. JavaScript will promote this 1 to a string and then concatenate them together. So this is something where you've seen the weird JavaScript things like this yields 1, and then like this plus this, if I can get a good one, you get like 11, and it doesn't make any sense. This is like one of those weird JavaScript things. Anytime you're adding things of different types, JavaScript will promote them to the higher type. So like integers are the lowest level type, then floats, decimals, and strings are gradually up there. So anytime you have something that's a string and you're concatenating it with another integer, you're not actually adding them together, you're concatenating them together. And this happens whenever you'll see we're getting like input from a user later. So say a user is like, you're making a little calculator application and you're getting input from text boxes. The input that comes back is a string. So you have to actually tell JavaScript, oh, this is an integer, it's actually not a string, so that it doesn't add 1 and 1 as 11, and instead actually performs the mathematical operation and adds them as 2. So this is one of those like really quirky things that happens. But I'm going to clear the console here. And that's another thing we wanted to talk about was JavaScript wants you to end every line in a semicolon, but all of the JavaScript compilers are generally smart enough that if you forget, it's not going to throw a big hissy fit. This is both advantageous and really difficult to debug, because sometimes it thinks that you wanted a semicolon somewhere, so the compiler will add it for you, but you really didn't want it there. So it's just something to watch out for. And because JavaScript is a functional language, there's a big difference between this and this. So clear is a function, but when I call clear without the parentheses, aka I'm not invoking it, I actually get the function back. And this is how we can pass functions back and forth to other functions and to other arbitrary values. So here you can see the clear function. This is a function built into the V8 engine that just clears the console. And here I'm actually invoking the clear function, which you can see clears the console. So when you see something, this is the function, and this is going to return the actual text that composes the function, the code that is the function. And this will actually run or execute the function. And similarly, you could have as many arbitrary parameters as you would like in here. But without the parentheses, you're not actually invoking the function. Instead, you're just using the function. So one of the things that we're going to make today is a simple little like to-do application. So like I have to go to the store, I have to get milk. But we're going to make it in the console first, so that you understand how the code works, and then we're going to move into the DOM so that we can start adding some interactions and some click handlers and event handlers. So first what we need to do is create an array. So in JavaScript, the way that we define a variable is with the var keyword, var. Now, it's not necessary. I can just do this. However, I'm polluting the global namespace. So it's a really bad idea. So everything in JavaScript is namespaced in braces. So variables only exist within their scope. It's very similar to Java or Ruby or other console-based languages that you might be working with. When you do this, regardless of your scope, you've now created a global variable. It's accessible everywhere. It's a really bad idea. You should always scope your variables with var. To create an array, we can use just empty brackets. It's the accepted norm. You can create a new array object. This is very similar to Java. You would say new array, but you will rarely see this except in old timers who programmed way back in the day. Instead, we use the shorthand syntax. So this will create an empty array called to-do. We can see it's an empty array. And if we want to insert things, we can set something at an index equal to, I don't know, get milk. That was my example earlier. And it's going to return the string get milk. And then if we look at to do, we can see to do at 0 is get milk. If we don't know the index or we just want to push onto the end, we can use the push function, which is JavaScript's kind of push onto the end of this array. It's almost like a stack at this point. So get milk, get pepperoni that I'm probably going to spell wrong. I don't know. Get peppers. OK. And here we can see that to-do.push actually returns an integer. So it returns the index which it pushed, which is really helpful whenever you're trying to do, try to actually find the last index. So now if we look at to-do, we can see we have 2 items in our array. Yeah?
So push index 2, but that shouldn't be.
No, it returns the index of the next object. So if you were to say, sorry, I could say to-do at like to-do.push foo should equal, should equal bar. And to-do.push foo will return what the next index should be. So if I run this, it'll add foo and then bar after it. Because to-do.push foo returned 3 because it returned the next index that would be inserted. You could also think of it as it returns the total number of elements now. That's the same thing. So now we have our to-do list, and this is exciting because we're playing with arrays. And let's actually make a function to do this for us, because .push and using brackets isn't nearly as explicit as if we made a function called add_to_do. So we'll add a to-do, and it'll take an item parameter. And this is the method signature for any kind of JavaScript function, is just function, the name of the function, and any parameters that we would like. One interesting thing to note about JavaScript is that it doesn't actually care how many parameters you pass, and I'll show that in a second. But we've given one named parameter called item, and it's accessible inside the scope of our function. But if I pass 10 variables into add_to_do, they all get passed in. Unlike Java and other languages that might be similar, you're going to get some type of like invalid argument exception or like wrong number of parameters, and the whole thing's going to blow up. JavaScript doesn't care. You can pass it as many arbitrary arguments as you want, and it's just going to evaluate them, and they go into what's called the global arguments array, which we'll show in a second. So we're going to add a to-do, and really all we're going to do is kind of proxy this to push that item onto our global to-do list. So we define this function. The function returns undefined. And here, if I just call add_to_do without any parentheses, you can see it's returning the function we just wrote. And I can call add_to_do. I'm running out of things to do. Get a new iPhone. And now if I look at to-do again, I added get a new iPhone at the end. What's interesting is that we're not typecasting anything. So I can also add 1. I don't know why I need to do 1, but I need to do 1. And you can see how it's not actually typecasted as an array or as a string like everything else. It's actually put in there as an integer, and you can tell that because it's a different color and it's not surrounded by the double quotes. So we actually have a list here or an array, but they're not all the same type, which is different from other languages that you might be working with. So there's no need for everything to be the same type if it's pushed into an array. Now let's add another function for actually removing things once we do them. So we'll write a method called remove_to_do, and that'll take an index. So we're not actually going to search and find the to-do. We're just going to delete the one that's at that index. And JavaScript is very interesting. This is one of those quirks. You can call to-do.delete at index, and you might think it's going to do exactly what you want it to do. But it's not. It's going to delete the item at the index, and it's going to replace it with an undefined value. So you're going to have, for example, say I deleted index 1. I would have get milk undefined foo bar get a new iPhone 1. We don't want that. We actually want it to remove it and then shift everything back down over. And this is one of the biggest mistakes that JavaScript developers make when they try to remove something from an array. They think that they just call delete and it deletes it, which is true. It deletes it, but it leaves an undefined space. It leaves like a gap in your array. So we can't actually do this. We have to use another function called splice, which essentially breaks the array into two parts and squishes them together. So we want to splice index comma 1. And the way splice works is we say go to that index, pop it out, and then keep one of everything afterward. Is the simple way to think about it. So instead of just removing it and leaving an empty hole there, we remove it and squish it back together. So this is our remove to do function. We can see that we just wrote, and if we want to remove, say, the first to do, and now if we look at our to-dos, we can see get peppers has shifted down. We got rid of get milk. And just to show you what delete would do, I lied. So no, it's not reduce, it's move. Okay, well, ignore me. But trying to think what it is. JavaScript has a remove method for arrays, but it replaces it with undefined. useSlice, that was the moral of the story. So now we have two functions. We have add to do and we have remove to do, and they're very basic. They follow nomenclature. We know exactly what they do. One thing I forgot to mention is JavaScript generally uses camel case, but it doesn't care. You can write a function with underscores. You'll see functions with underscores and various things. Camel case is kind of the accepted norm. So now if we jump back into our text editor, we're going to actually make a little application here. So we're going to make a to-do list, but we're going to make it inside the DOM, and we're going to use the DOM to keep track of our elements instead of this JavaScript array. So let's add a header, and we'll add some basic HTML stuff. We'll call this my to-dos. We'll say, we'll give it a text box. And let's give this text box an ID of new to-do, just so we can reference it.
What do you mean by DOM? Can you explain what that is?
Oh, so DOM is the document object model. It's the way that HTML is constructed. Sorry, I thought this was part of Ryan's talk. So DOM is basically you have like your HTML global tag, and then you have your head tag, like we have here, and we have the body, the header. This is all the DOM. It's just the way that your document is structured in terms of HTML. So you can see like everything under body is like collapsible under body. It's just the way that the browser interprets all of these different tags. And I'm going to use an HTML5 attribute for placeholder here. If you're not using an HTML5 browser, it won't show up. And let's add a button that the user can click. We'll call it new to do button. And we'll end that tag. And then finally, we need a place to store our to-dos. So we'll just create a div that's empty, and we'll call it to-dos list. It's important that we're giving these IDs because that's how we're going to reference them. That's part of the document object model. We have IDs and we have classes. IDs are the most specific reference. Classes get less specific, and then you have actual element references, such as like body, header, which are the least specific. So we're going to use these IDs in our JavaScript code to actually grab these objects and manipulate them or get their value or whatever. So I can hear some of you guys are still typing. Sorry. I'll bring this back up in a second, but so this is basically what we're gonna get. It's gonna be an h1 tag, a nice little text box that says add a new to do, and an add button. It's pretty boring. It doesn't do anything. Like when I click the add button, nothing happens. Yes, I can type text in, but like I hit the enter key, nothing happens. So we should change that. We're gonna be writing inline JavaScript so that everything's in one file. But if there's time at the end, I want to show you how to externalize your JavaScript because it's really important. You don't really want to write inline JavaScript for like pedagogical standpoint. We're going to do it here today just so you can see everything in one document. So right before the end of our body tag, we're going to make a new script tag, and we're going to tell that it is JavaScript. And this is just a standard HTML tag. And basically, what I want to do is when the user clicks the add button, I want the browser to say like, hey, that hurt, or like, ouch, that hurt. So what we have to do first is actually grab the new to-do button so that we can add a click handler on it so that we know when something happens to it. And I'm going to store it in a variable. So I use the var keyword, and I'm going to call it new to-do button. And I'm going to use a lot of built-in JavaScript functions here. So JavaScript has a keyword called document, which refers to this document, the one that I'm like currently on. It also has another method called getElementById, which TextMate recognized as a keyword because it turned it in red. So basically, this takes a string, and it searches the DOM for that ID. Now, IDs are supposed to be unique within every single page. However, not all web developers follow that, and they break standards, and it's not nice. But this will return the first occurrence of the ID that it finds. So to get the to-do button, you can see up here we gave it this ID of new-to-do-button. I'm just going to copy and paste that here. And now in the new to-do button variable, this local variable, I have access to this actual button element. And the button element has certain properties. It has a style property, it has an ID, it has a class property. And they're all available based off of the HTML element that you have selected. So a span has different properties than a div has different properties than the body tag. So let's actually add a click handler to this to-do button. So JavaScript is event-oriented, or it's designed such that when X happens, Y should also happen. Or when I do this, then this happens. So we can add a click handler. And the way we do that is with the onClick. Pretty self-explanatory. So when the new to-do button is clicked, I want to perform some kind of function. I want something to happen. And in this case, I'm just going to use the alert keyword. It's a built-in function of JavaScript. It's going to bring up a text box or a little pop-up that says exactly what we type in here, which is going to be ouch, that hurt. So kind of running through this code, it reads very English-like. So we're going to grab the element that has the ID new to-do button. When it's clicked, I want to alert ouch, that hurts. So let's see if we go back to the browser and refresh this. Is that what happens? It's exactly what happens. This little dialog, the way it looks and the way it's styled is handled by the browser. So it's going to look different in Firefox. Personally, I feel that Firefox's looks a lot cleaner than Chrome's. But we don't really have control over these styles. This is just a simple alert dialog. So now that we have a click handler on our to-do button, let's actually try to grab the value of the text box and alert that. So the way we're going to do that is just like we have the new to-do button. I'm going to copy and paste this, and I'm going to try to grab the actual new to-do, which is the text box up here. So we're going to use this ID. And let's alert this text box. So does everyone follow that? So we just did the same thing, but instead of grabbing the button, we're grabbing the text box. So we're grabbing this part here. And instead of alerting static text, ouch, that hurt, we're going to alert that text box. So hopefully that'll give us the value of that text box. So if we go back and refresh the page, and I type something in here, and I click the add button, it says object HTML input element. Well, I really wanted to get like these mumble-jumbled characters. Why am I getting this object HTML input element? And that's because this variable is referring to the HTML input element, because that is what this getElementID is returning. It's an HTML input element of type text. So what we need to do is somehow get the value. And the way you do that is very basic. You would call dot value. Very similar to what you would do in any other language. What's interesting here is that value is a property of the HTML input element. It is not a method. So notice that we're not surrounding it with parentheses. We're actually calling it directly. And for those of you that have Java experience, this is kind of the difference between like the dot length property of an array and the dot size method of an array list. So it gives you a kind of a similar comparison. So we use just straight up dot value. We can go back and hopefully we'll get a nice little alert message with whatever we type in the box. And we can continue to change this, and it'll change alongside it because it grabs the value at runtime. So that's cool. Now we have the text. We know what the value of the text is. We want to add it to our to-dos list. So if we kind of go down here, and those functions that we wrote earlier, I'm going to add them back in, the ones that we wrote in the console. So it was add to do, and it was to do.push this item, and this was remove to do. It took an index, and this was to do.splice index 1. And we also need to declare our empty array at start. So this is exactly what we did in the beginning, but I've moved it into the script tag, so it's on this page. And we know it works because we played with it in the console. So we're kind of ready to move on. Sorry. So what I want to do is, instead of, when I click this button, instead of me alerting whatever the value is, I actually want to call the add to do function, because we know that works. So I'm going to replace alert with add to do. And we know that the value that is coming from the text box is a string. So basically, we're just pushing strings onto the array, which is exactly what we did earlier. So let's go back here, and I'm going to say like hello world, and nothing happened, nothing happened. Why isn't anything happening? Well, if we go back in the developer console, and we look at what to do is, you can see it's actually filled up with hello world, because I clicked that button a bajillion times. So why isn't anything happening on the screen? Well, we haven't actually told JavaScript to do anything. In the background, it's doing exactly what we told it to do, which is when I click the button, add whatever text is in the text box to this global to-do array. And that's exactly what it did. So we need to now tell JavaScript to somehow display that array every single time that the user updates it. So let's write another method. We're going to call this function list-to-dos, and it doesn't take any parameters. And we're going to use JavaScript's for loop here to iterate over every single element in our list. And we're going to just, basically, we're going to append them to the DOM. So in kind of Java, you would do something like this. And you would say I less than to-do.length, I++. In JavaScript, it's exactly the same, except there are no declared types. So this is just var, not int. So if you're coming from a Java background, it's very similar. We create a variable I, and we're looping over each element. And what we want to do in here is we're going to create elements. So just like JavaScript can grab elements that already exist, it can also create elements on the fly that don't pre-exist in the source. So the way we do that is, again, with document. And it's pretty semantic. It's create element. And it takes a parameter of an element name. So I named this one div, so I'm going to create it a div. Div is just an HTML container. It actually stands for divider. Very few people know that. Now you know. And it's kind of just a grouping of objects. And I'm going to give it a class name, which is the CSS class that it will refer to, that we're going to use later. And I'm going to call it item. So this div is essentially going to hold our to-do item. And inside it, we're going to have like the to-do and then like a little X to mark that it's been done. So additionally, I need to make something to hold the text. And I'm going to make a span element to do that. And I'm going to set the inner HTML of that span equal to whatever to-do we're on. So we create a div. We haven't done anything with the div yet. We create a span, and we say span, your content is whatever the to-do is. So in the previous example, we would create 11 spans, and they would all have content of hello world. So just because we created them, we haven't actually done anything with them. So now we need to actually add them to this actual document. We need to somehow put them in the document. So the way we do that is say, we could say like document.append child, and we could just say div, and that's going to append the div, but the div doesn't actually have the content in it. So before we can do that, we need to append the content to the div. So basically, at the end of the document, we're going to push this div on. So if we go back here and we try to do this, it doesn't seem to be working.
You're missing a period between div and class.
35. Okay. That's not why it's not working. But it's not supposed to work. But thank you. It's not working because we can't actually append things. We can't actually append things to the document. We actually have to append them to this to-dos list that we created earlier. Because we have our document, we're saying append things to it, but it's not actually mutable. We have to maintain like within the body tag or within the header tag. So up here at the top, let's again copy and paste one of these lines and grab this ID this time. And we're going to call it to-dos list. So everyone follow what I did there. We just grab the next element, and this time it's a div. And instead of saying document.append child, we're going to say to-dos list.append child, which means that we're going to add a div every time the user clicks the add button. But as you can see, like, it's still not happening. Well, we haven't actually called this function anywhere. So JavaScript has no idea that you want it to list to-dos anywhere. So we actually want it to list the to-dos after we click the add button. So every time we click the add button, we would expect JavaScript to list these to-dos out. So let's refresh the page and try this again. And you can see, well, something's a little buggy there. What's going on? Every time I add something, it adds all of the other ones that had previously been added and then re-adds the new ones. So what's happening is we're calling append child. So we have this box, if you will. It's a div called to-dos list. And we're saying append child, which is basically the DOM's way of saying add. So I have this array list, or this array of all these little to-dos, and every time I click add, I'm iterating through every single one of them and adding them to this toy box. But the problem is the toy box already has toys in it. So before we add them again, we need to empty the toy box. So back in our list to-dos method, the easiest way to do that is just say to-dos list dot inner HTML is the empty string. And if we go back and refresh, whenever we add to-dos, we should see them showing up kind of one at a time. And we have this iterative process. So to the end user, it looks like when they click add to-do, the to-do pops up at the bottom. But really what's happening from your perspective as a programmer is you're clearing the to-dos list and you're adding them all again every time the to-do array changes. So it's a little bit different from what the user sees and what actually happens in the background. So ideally, this text box would clear, and we could also hit the enter key instead of clicking the add button, because personally I don't like to have to move my mouse back and forth, and I don't like to have to hit the backspace key. So whenever we want to reset the value of a text box, we can just say the value is equal to nothing. So let's go try this out. And now when I click add, you can see it resets the value. That's kind of cool. And this works. And to add the click handler for enter, we need to add another event handler to the text box. So on our text box, which we called new to do, we're going to add an event handler. But click doesn't really make sense in this case because we're not really clicking, we're hitting a key. So the event handler we want to use is on key press, and this is going to be a function. And this function takes an argument. I normally name it E. It stands for event. In this case, it's the keyboard event that fired this function. So what I want to do is just inspect this. We're using the console.log. So we'll go back here, refresh the page, type in some text. I hit the enter key, and we'll take a look at the console. So the console fired this keyboard event. This is a built-in JavaScript keyboard event. And if I inspect any one of these, we can see it has a lot of different properties here. But if I look at this last one, which is when I press the enter key, the thing that I'm really interested in is this key code here, which is the integer representation of which key was pressed. So I know from my programming experience, and because I just saw it here, that the enter key is a key code of 13 in JavaScript. That's actually true in most languages. So what we really want to do is say, if the key code is 13, then we want to simulate a click of the new to-do button. So instead of copying and pasting this code, which is really bad practice, what we actually want to do is just simulate clicking the to-do button. Now, that's not going to move your mouse over there, click it, and move your mouse back. It's going to happen in terms of the code. So it's really just going to fire the click event for the new to-do button, which is really what we want it to do anyway. So why did I use triple equals instead of double equals? In JavaScript, single equals is assignment, double equals is comparison, and triple equals is comparison. However, like I said before, JavaScript does a lot of implicit typecasting. So for example, the string 1 equals the integer 1. So this is true in JavaScript. However, the triple equals not only compares the object's values, but it also compares their types. You're looking at me funny. It's true, I promise. It's weird, and it really confuses programmers. So for example, this will evaluate for true, and this will really screw programmers up, because if I want to actually check if something is an integer, I either have to say, like, if it's an integer, so %, of whatever the value is, and they're equal, or I can use triple equals. So ideally, you just use triple equals everywhere. Rarely would you ever use the double equal sign unless you don't care what the type of the object is. You're only concerned about their values. So I use triple equals whenever possible. When coding your JavaScript, you should use triple equals as much as possible. So we're checking to see if this key code is 13, which is the enter key. It's ideal just in terms of like your coding practice that you say something like this, so enter key, or if you're British, you can type the return key. I don't really care. Just so that other programmers who may not be as familiar with the key codes know, oh, they're checking for the enter key. So if we go back here to our wonderful application and type things in, I'm hitting the enter key. I know you can't really see that, but when I hit the enter key, things show up. It's magic. And now we have like an application that's pretty functional. So this is cool. But ideally, we would like to remove them. We already wrote the remove to-do list functionality, so now we just need to add a little X that whenever the user clicks it, it automatically removes that to-do. So where would we do that? Well, we would do that when we're actually creating our to-do items. So in this list to-dos function, we actually want to create another element. We're going to create an A tag, which is the HTML hyperlink. So up at the top here, before we create our div, let's make a link. And it's an A tag. Oops. And we want to give it certain properties. So first thing we want to give it is a class. So we're going to call this delete to-do link. And we want to give it some inner HTML, which is basically its value. I'm going to use this. This is the times symbol. It's basically an X, but it's shorter, so it's symmetrical because I have OCD. And this is where JavaScript becomes really cool, because I'm going to dynamically assign a function to this attribute that doesn't yet exist on the DOM. So what did we do? We created a link, we added a class and some text. And now I'm going to add a handler to it before it ever exists. So it doesn't actually exist until we add it to the DOM. You can't perform functions on it until we add it to the DOM. But I can add functions to it before I add it to the DOM. And they exist once it's added to the DOM. So basically, all I want to do is whenever we click this link, I want to remove the to-do at I. Because remember, we're in a loop here. But I can tell you right away, and because I'm running a little short on time and I'm not going to demo it, this isn't going to work, because JavaScript is scoped. So whenever this onClick handler is run, I will be whatever to-do.length was, because it's going to run through this loop, append them all, and then I is whatever its last variable was. So no matter which X we click, It's essentially like calling remove to do at the last index. And this is because JavaScript isn't actually writing this code yet until it's actually added to the DOM. So I is dynamically calculated, if you want to think of it that way. So I is whatever I is at the existence of when the function is clicked, not whenever the function is created. So there's a subtle difference there, and this will cause you a lot of bugs in your JavaScript code. But just to kind of reiterate, whenever you have a variable inside a function, it's whatever the variable's value is when the function is called, not when the function is created. Anytime you're creating functions in a loop and you're using your loop invariant inside the function, it is not what you think it is. It is whatever it is when the function is called. So what we need to do is somehow inside this element store whatever index we want to remove. And I'm going to use the HTML5 set attribute, and we're going to use the data method. So we're going to say data remove index, and I'm just going to give it a value of I. What this is going to do is up here, see how we have like this ID? Essentially, what we're also creating is another function, or another, another attribute that is prefixed with data called remove index. So data remove index, and it's going to have a value of whatever the loop variable is. And that's fine because it's static once it's assigned to the element. So if we go back, now we have to actually add this link to our div. So that's very simple. Down here, we're just going to append the link. Then we're going to append the content. And then we're going to append that div to the parent. So if we go back and we actually add stuff, we see our nice little X. And it's not clickable. Well, why isn't it clickable? If I inspect this element, I can see that my class is to-do link, and here's that data remove index. And if I look at another one, we can see the index changes. And this is important because we need to know which index to remove. But why isn't it clickable? Well, HTML is really weird sometimes, and we actually have to give it an href attribute if we want it to be clickable. So we'll give it an href attribute of just the hash mark so that it's happy. We can go back, refresh our page, and now we can actually click on these things. Don't ask me why. JavaScript is weird sometimes, or HTML is weird sometimes. But you notice that it's not actually working. So if we go to our web inspector, we don't have any errors, so we're not doing anything wrong. So what could possibly be going wrong? Well, I never actually changed this variable. So I need to say link.getAttribute data remove index. But again, because it's scoped, this isn't going to work. Because this link variable refers to whichever last link variable I created. So instead, I need to actually reference the object that called this function. So in other words, this link here is not the same as this link here because they're called at different times. It's only true if this is the last element in the loop. So instead, I need to find out who invoked this onClick argument. And the way I do that is with the this, JavaScript's this keyword. And that says the guy who called me. So this. So I'm just going to replace link with this, and we're good to go. So now if we go back, refresh the DOM, and add a couple items. When you click on, I lied, it's not working. What did I do wrong now? Data remove index.
Do you need to like rewrite, like, do you need to reprint the whole list?
Remove to.
Oh, yes, you're right. Ha, someone, yes. That's my next point. Okay, so nothing's happening. I should read ahead because just like we did in the earlier point where we actually click the button, we need to rewrite the to-dos. In here, we're only calling remove to-do. And our remove to-do function only removed it from the index. We never actually repainted our list. So now if we do this, hopefully I won't look like an idiot. We can see it actually removes things. Cool. So now I'm going to do some magic before we move into jQuery. And I'm going to add a style sheet tag. Yeah, what's up?
Sorry. Can you went to the
Which part? The remove to do? Oh, this part? Okay. Also, all of this code is posted on my GitHub, which I can give Quentin the link to or something. Yeah. That way you guys can follow through. And my show notes are also on there, so you can follow through step by step with what I'm going through. Do you guys have questions about why this works or why? So essentially what we do is we make a link. This is whatever its content is. This is just for styling purposes, which I'll show in a second. This is because HTML is quirky and requires you to have an href tag on any link if you want it to be clickable. This is so that we can statically refer to which element we want to remove. And the reason we have to use this here instead of link is because link refers to whatever its last value was, not whatever it is inside this loop. So it has a lot to do with scope. Does that make sense? OK. So I'm going to add a style sheet tag that I made, which is also available on my GitHub. But so the way we add a style sheet is just the link tag. And you guys don't have this style sheet yet, so it's not going to help you much. But this was a kind of a plug for Ryan because you can do some really cool stuff with style sheets. So I'm an interactions designer too. So this is kind of what I did. I didn't change any of the code other than adding the style sheet. But we have this nice little interface. What's cool is that the only image that's on this page is the background. But what I've done is everything still behaves the same. So call Dylan. But what's cool is they're now little post-it notes. And I really need to eat lunch because I haven't eaten today. So this is all done with CSS. So this is where presentation and JavaScript mix. So the CSS code's posted online. I'm not going to go through it with you. It's very basic. It only works in Chrome and Safari because I only use WebKit styles. So if you look in Firefox, it's still going to look like crap. But we have this little X that shows up when I hover over it. That's done with CSS, not JavaScript. The fact that when I hover over the X, I doubt you can see it on the projector, but the background gets lighter. That's done with just CSS, not JavaScript. In fact, the only line that I changed was this line. And I will prove that to you by commenting it out, going back and refreshing the page. So this is where CSS and JavaScript have babies, because it's really cool. And you shouldn't know one without the other, because they play really, really nicely together. So let's actually make our code look a lot cleaner, because this looks it's readable, but it's not pretty. And yeah, so let's actually add jQuery. Which is a JavaScript framework that makes working with JavaScript a lot easier. So the first step in getting started with jQuery is to actually add jQuery to your application. And in your head tag, you would say script type equals text JavaScript. I can't type. And the source is wherever you're going to store jQuery, which I'll show you how to get in a second. In my case, it's in JavaScript's jQuery.js. So I'm going to go grab that real quick. So how do you get jQuery? Well, you go to Google and you type in jQuery. Sorry. Or you go to jQuery.com. Or you just go to Google and you type in jQuery and you click on the first link. And it takes you to jQuery.com. And this is what jQuery looks like. If you're interested in how it works, I suggest downloading the development version. It's not compressed. It's plain English. But I'm just going to download the production version. You click the download button. It sends you to a plain text page. This looks way more confusing than what we wrote. Don't try to read it. It's compressed and garbled. But look, hey, we used that, didn't we? So you can see it's actually something that's useful. So you would basically just download this, store it in your file, remember what it's called, and reference it in your document. So in my case, I have stuff I'm in the working directory. So JavaScripts, and I'll rename it jQuery.js. It's going to ask me to replace it because I have it. It should just do it for you. It's going to download it, and now it's in my document. So now if we go back and refresh, nothing has changed, which is a good sign because we haven't told jQuery to do anything. So what's cool is that jQuery has a built-in selector for document.getElementById, because now TextMate has a built-in shortcut for it that I haven't used, and like text editors have shortcuts for it, just like system.out.println. No one likes to type that. jQuery has the jQuery selector, which super long. You guys are going to hate to type it every single time. It is this, which is the $sign. That was sarcasm, by the way. So $sign is the jQuery selector. You can actually change it to whatever you want. If you look in the jQuery docs, it tells you how to change the selector. This is actually a proxy for this, which is the actual jQuery selector, but they use the $sign. Rarely will you ever see anything other than the $sign, unless you have an application where you're using multiple JavaScript frameworks and it conflicts in some way. So the reason I brought up CSS earlier is that JavaScript selectors are really difficult to work with, and CSS selectors are really nice. IDs start with a hash, classes start with a dot, and actual body elements, the tag names, just are their tag names. It's very simple and it's straightforward. And jQuery actually adopted this in its selectors. So to actually select an element by ID, we refer to it by the CSS selector. So originally we had document.getElementById new to do. Instead, I can say $hash new to do. And this is telling jQuery to find the element with the ID new to do. If we were looking for the class of new to do, we would simply add a dot. And this says find all items that have a class named to do. And if we were looking for the body element, we would just type body, and that would find the body element. So if we go through quickly and replace all of these guys, because I'm running short on time, with just the $sign and their hash equivalent. Because they're now jQuery objects, jQuery doesn't use JavaScript standards. It doesn't deprecate nicely. So all of your event handlers in JavaScript start with the keyword on click, on key press, on key up, on key down. In jQuery, it's the same exact thing without the on. So our new to do button is no longer just on click, it's now click. But click itself is a function. It's a jQuery function. So we actually have to call it. And what it takes as a parameter to its function is the function that you want to yield. So instead of assigning click a value like we did before, where we said onClick equals a function, we're passing the function that we want to be performed on click as a parameter to the click function. So this is a subtle difference, and this is how in JavaScript you can pass functions back and forth. We're passing an anonymous function as a parameter to click. So click takes a parameter called callback in jQuery docs, and the callback gets yielded inside the click function. So similarly with key press, we'll do the same thing. We'll just copy and paste this inside, and we should be good for now. Nope, I lied. OK. So all of our append child things we need to also replace with jQuery, because jQuery doesn't, by default, have all of that. One thing worth noting is that the .click functionality, this actually invoking a click, is the same in JavaScript and jQuery. So to actually force a click, it's just .click with no parameters called as a method. So what I'm going to do in the interest of time and not typing all this out is to actually go and copy and paste my final code, which it replaces all of your it replaces all of our JavaScript with jQuery. So actually, I'm just going to keep this open for you. So we've already done this part. We already fixed these two functions. The rest of it, for example, in our add to do method, sorry, this isn't fun. So with jQuery, we can actually directly manipulate the DOM a lot easier than JavaScript. So I completely ixnayed our add to do and remove to do functions, because we don't actually need a JavaScript array to keep track of them, because we can just keep track of them by their existence on the DOM, because they all have a class name of item. So that way we can easily keep track of which ones are which, and we're not having an array that gets printed out to the DOM. Instead, we just directly modify the values that are on the DOM. So one of the first things we did is got rid of these two functions. And instead of calling the like resetting all of these values inside the click function, we would move them to the add to do function. And the add to do function actually changes completely. It is what actually adds everything to the DOM. So in this add to do function, we combined add to do and list to dos. So what we do is we use jQuery to create the element. You give it a tag, you give it an ending tag. Instead of saying class name, it's add class. Instead of inner HTML, I'll write these down. Instead of inner HTML, it is just HTML. But you'll notice they're now functions. So they're parameters to functions instead of assignment. Everything in jQuery is a function. There's no assignment, there's no anything. Here we have the click. So before it was link.onClick equals function. Here it's click that takes a function as a parameter. And we wrap the item in this. So just like before we had to use this, with jQuery we get this back and we have to wrap this in the jQuery selector. So this is a little bit confusing. The function invoker that is called is not of a jQuery type. So we can't actually perform jQuery functions on it. Instead, it's just a regular HTML type. So we surround it with a $ in the parentheses so that we can use it as a jQuery object. And here, I just added some nice little styles. I'm saying get the parent, which is the post-it note, and fade it out, and then remove it from the DOM. So there's just this a nice little effect. This is built into jQuery. It's really nice for subtle animations. It takes two parameters. The first one is a speed. The second one is a function that gets executed after the animation is completed. So I just use fast. You could also use a number like 500. It doesn't care. It's pretty smart. I generally use fast. Again, we create a div. This is the same div that we created before, but we use jQuery. So we actually create the tag that's self-closing. jQuery knows how to interpret that. We give it a class. And I added another class for hide, which was, it just hides the element. It's a CSS class. We create our span element. One subtle difference here is that our value, but before we were using .value, it's no longer a property. You can't directly access that property of a jQuery object, so it's just .val. But .val can also take a parameter, and this is where jQuery sometimes becomes confusing. So if I call .val with no parameters, it returns the value of whatever object I'm calling it on. If I give it parameters, it sets the value of that object to whatever those parameters are. So the method's overloaded. And this is similar to like, you can almost view like jQuery and like primitive JavaScript is like the way you view arrays and array lists in Java, where they have all these wrapper methods and you can't directly access anything, but it does a lot of stuff for you in the background. Instead of append child, the child seemed completely necessary. Of course it's a child, so jQuery drops it. It's just append. So you just call append, and append can only take other jQuery objects. So for example, I can't append like foo. I have to actually append a jQuery object. It'll throw an exception if you don't give it a jQuery object. And inside here, we now reset the value, and then we fade in the div. So the reason that we can completely ditch all of the existing DOM element, or the existing architecture that we had before that we started with, is because now we can directly access all of these elements in the DOM with jQuery, which we could have done with JavaScript, but it would have been really confusing and not as easy to understand, and you wouldn't have gotten to play with JavaScript arrays at all. So if we go and actually look at the final product, it'll behave exactly the same, except we'll have nice little animations that jQuery has added for us. And you can see it's really subtle, but they add in, and these auto wrap. So I have all of these little post-it note guys, and I can remove any one of them, and it fades out nicely. The other ones pop over. The fade in and the fade out is all done with jQuery. It's just one simple command that wraps jQuery for you. Do you want me to keep going? OK. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions? Like I said, all my slides and stuff will be online. Cool. Sorry.